Hello and welcome to Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman, and today we're going to have a two-part show discussing the Christianity of the United States of America. I've got two people here to talk to me about this to help me understand it a little better, since I actually don't know as much as I'd like to know about it. So I have Ryan Sutter and Jack Caravela. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, when we think about religion in our government, it's kind of a relevant topic now. You know, since the new year began, we have a new Congress. We have a new president, and there was a lot of talk before about what President Obama's religious views were. He doesn't seem to be as outwardly religious as the previous president, but of course there was the Newdow lawsuit regarding the inaugural prayer, and even recently he gave a speech admitting faith-based organizations will receive government support. So even his religious views, even though he certainly seems a lot less religious than his predecessor, are still making the news. So I think it's a good time to talk about this. I know I said we'll start with part one, was America founded as a Christian nation? But before we actually get to the founding of the United States of America, let's talk about just people coming over here when it was still a colony, and when they were first forming as a colony. Because one thing that people say is that, well, this was established, you know, the Europeans first came over here for religious freedom. People always mention things like the Puritans. So how would we respond to that? I mean, doesn't that kind of give us a basis for our government?
Well, I would start with the fact that the Pilgrims, who were a sect of Puritanism that disassociated itself from the Puritans in England, came to this country for religious reasons. However, they weren't very tolerant of other religions. So if they had actually founded this country, we wouldn't just have a Christian nation. We would have a nation devoted to their sect that would not have equal protection under the law for anyone else. And this was a problem. There was one important exception, and that was Reverend Roger Williams, who was banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony because he called them on their religious intolerance. And he went on to found the colony of Rhode Island as a secular government. Now, we should mention the term secular wasn't used back then.
Right.
It's a more modern term.
But the same intent is kind of...
Right, but he did not want religion and government to be intermingled, mostly because he felt it would corrupt religion. And that's an important exception, but definitely you will not find a basis of government in the practices of the Pilgrims.
What's interesting is, though, a lot of the charters for the initial settlements here, the Charter of Jamestown, the first Charter of Massachusetts, a lot of these really early settlement charters did explicitly mention Christianity. And a lot of people today will bring that up. You know, I saw multiple... I've seen multiple sources that cite the Mayflower Compact as a basis for, for this. And it does quite specifically talk about the advancement of the Christian faith as being a purpose for the founding of these colonies. But one perspective that you don't hear very often is, yes, there were religious refugees, yes, there were members of the Protestant Puritan movement that were coming here, but they're not the only ones who were coming here and settling these colonies. In fact, they probably made up a relative minority of the people who were coming here. There were people coming here because they were seeking fortune, riches, gold. They were trying to establish, you know, new footholds and new lands for their different European kings. Spain was over here. England was here, and it was a lot messier than just the Puritans and the Pilgrims came here and they settled everything down. So you know, the point is that these charters, most of these charters, also explicitly pledge allegiance to the King of England. They're not the basis of American government, and in fact, when the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War happened, it was as much a repudiation and rebellion against these initial charters as anything else, because they were establishing rule of the Church of England and Christianity as a specific branch. So you can't really say that something that was sort of actually rejected out of hand during the Revolution was the basis of what was founded with the Declaration and the Constitution.
Because obviously we don't still pay our respects, our allegiance to the royal houses of Europe anymore. And if we were going to base our religion on that of the immigrants that came here, maybe we should start looking to the Native Americans' religions.
And if you want to, as we'll get into later, if you want to get the real background as to what the founders were thinking in crafting the Constitution, It goes back to British common law and John Locke, we can talk about a bit too. There are a lot of prescriptive and oppressive laws that are religious that codify social behavior too, that we don't have anything, we purposely have nothing to do with now.
Okay, well that's a good segue then. Let's move on, because obviously that stuff was before the United States of America was established. Things were just a colony. Where our ancestors were expected to pay their allegiance to the kings and queens of Europe. But once we got to the 1770s, 1780s, and the framework was coming into being for the United States, a lot of people will argue when you look at the founding fathers, and we're talking about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, weren't they Christians?
Well, we have to introduce the term deist, because Franklin, Madison, Jefferson, they specifically called themselves deists. And perhaps, Ryan, you'd like to handle that definition.
Well, deism is a kind of a lost term these days. But when the Enlightenment sort of took place in Europe and philosophy was flowering again, people were starting to realize, people like Hume and he mentioned Locke already, they were starting to recognize that God, while they still accepted a belief in God, it was more of a prime first mover, then he pushed the universe and then got out of the way kind of God, not the Christian, anthropomorphic person.
Not the God of Genesis.
Yeah. And there was a lot of analysis. Of one name that didn't get mentioned in your list was Thomas Paine, who's not officially a founding father, but Thomas Paine did write the pamphlets that helped stir up the Revolutionary War to begin with.
And his writings influenced some of the people.
Very much. Yeah. And Thomas Paine was, he's the fifth Beatle of the founding fathers, really. He was very involved, and he specified deism very well in his later writing, The Age of Reason, where he talked about how it was, he believed in a God that, but he rejected revelation, private revelation as a source of information. He thought that, the universe is the revelation. Nature is the revelation. And so deism would use terms like nature's God, laws of nature, the very types of things that we wind up seeing specifically included in the Constitution, to refer more to a general deity than to the specific Christian God.
Right, and we have to remember this is before Darwin, before we had advanced cosmology and Big Bang and so forth. So the only way to explain why everything was here was some creator.
Some sort of prime mover, yeah.
Right.
So even if not all of them at least were explicitly Christians, it seems that they were religious, right? I mean, when we look at the Declaration of Independence, we see terms, I had terms listed here, nature's God, they say creator, they say divine providence. These things all hint of at least people that have a faith of some sort.
Well, it's interesting because this is the document that people bring up most often to try and prove a religious intent.
The Declaration of Independence.
And really it's not anything of the sort. First of all, I'd mentioned that it's not a foundation of government, it's a list of grievances against the King of England, saying why, so it doesn't set out any laws to follow. But there's an important part that gets overlooked sometime. It says, quote, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it says explicitly that government does not derive its power and authority from God. That's a pretty radical statement.
Separating themselves from the European governments, too.
Exactly, right. And the different terms, nature's God, for instance, is a deist term. You don't hear people say nature's God anymore. And it is supposed to assert the equality of men. And I use men in that kind of outdated term now because the only people who were in power were white landowners. But the term creator doesn't appear in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, and we know that because John Adams kept a copy of it. At that time, it was used, the words equal creation were used. So that's something that was changed. And the other one I think that's brought up a lot is divine providence, which is another common deist term to kind of divorce the idea of God from the creator God, or I'm sorry, from the personal God that most Christians are familiar with now. So
So they meant divine providence, you mean, kind of just as a vague power or spirit watching over them? Then?
Well, kind of that nature's laws will favor people who are rational, and it's almost as, well, to me, hope I'm not going too far, it's almost saying good luck.
Yeah.
That,
it's a Darwinist approach almost 100 years before its time. There.
Right.
Yeah.
And an interesting comparison to draw, the same year, 1776, the Constitution of North Carolina, to give an example of the type of language they could have used if they intended, not, because they have these sort of vague references to laws of nature,
right,
nature's God. The Constitution of the State of North Carolina said that no person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Protestant religion or the divine authority of the Old and New Testaments or who shall hold religious principles incompatible with the freedom and safety of the state shall be capable of holding any office. Now, that's very specific.
Right.
It's, you had to respect the divine authority of the Old and New Testaments. You had to be a member of the Protestant religion. You had to uphold the truth of that. So when
and that
they
was
were
written the same year.
those were in the same year.
Okay.
And what it shows, what it really illustrates, is that the founding fathers, when they were writing this, they could have modeled, and there are any number of documents like this, they could have been specific like that. But you look at their language, their terminology, and it really reflects where they were coming from, because they had the opportunity to take this very explicit route, and they very explicitly chose the deistical language.
Yeah.
And I think that really shows a lot about their intent,
Yeah.
even if you didn't have their private letters and things
And
like
intellect. It's a good diplomacy tactic.
Right, because they did have to get along with the Christians
Right, yeah.
too. So that was language that would accomplish that.
Yeah, and the point was, as you said, was to dissolve political bands, I think is the actual term in the Declaration of Independence, not to set up a theocracy of any sort, or even to establish any government.
Right.
It was severing a government.
Exactly.
So it opened a need for a constitution that came a few years later. But well, then, what compelled them, if they're not Christian and not terribly religious, then one of the questions I have here is, what compelled them to form a secular government? Where did they get their ideas from? We mentioned Thomas Paine, but
Well, Thomas Paine, we should mention too, was British by birth, and he suffered through the acts. Trying to remember well, in 1673, laws were passed in England that prescribed religious tests and really codified discrimination on religious basis. And he fought against that, as did other famous people of the time, including Mary Shelley. But that was one influence, but you have to go back as well to Locke, who we mentioned earlier, the British philosopher, who set up a philosophical understanding of government as something that should basically protect the people and commerce, but not get involved in religion at all. And he was a very big influence on Thomas Jefferson, on Adams, on these founders we're talking about, who really drafted the Constitution. And there were other important political thinkers of the time, too, Enlightenment era, that had a great effect on this concept of a secular government for the founders.
a lot of them saw the pernicious effect of religion and how the kings had wielded it to undesired effect on the common people, is what you're saying essentially, right? So they were very aware of that when they were crafting their constitution.
The Test and Corporation Acts? I mean,
Was that the term?
I think that might have been it for determining.
Were you going to add something?
Well, I was just going to point out that religion and government could not be more intertwined than they had been in the Church of England, where the king is not only the monarch over the country, he's also the leader,
head of the church,
the head of the church. And that that dynamic, that situation, had been the cause of multiple wars, had been the cause of a lot of the religious persecution and people fleeing England in the first place. So they had, even those who were specifically Christian, Protestant believers, they had very, very strong reasons not to want their church and state together because it was injurious to their religion.
Right, yeah.
And you know, it's exactly backwards, I think, of how a lot of people look at it today, that they weren't trying to set up a Christian government. They were trying to set up a secular government so that Christianity wouldn't be damaged. It wouldn't be, what's the word I'm looking for? Wouldn't be co-opted into the government, because they had centuries of experience with that, and it never worked out. You know, so there were specifically, besides Locke, there were also a couple of other philosophers who were working around the same period of time. Montesquieu came up with the idea of the checks and balances of legislative and executive and judicial branches. Other names are escaping me right now, but there were some really influential writers, and that was where some of the things they wrote are almost word for word, as the fundamentals of how the government is set up.
I've read somewhere where one historian called the Declaration of Independence pure Locke, that John Locke could have written it himself because it was so close to his type of language.
So we see where they culled their information from and their ideas.
Right.
Let's get back to the documents that they had to write, because we mentioned the Declaration of Independence, and then I said that kind of opened up the need for the Constitution. So then let's move ahead like a decade here. And they write this Constitution. Doesn't that found us as a Christian nation when we look at that? I mean, obviously we think not, but why not?
Well, first of all, there's no mention of God or Jesus in the Constitution, and that's not an accident. There have been many attempts to insert that kind of language. From 1964, or I'm sorry, 1864, when President Lincoln was approached with that kind of amendment, and every 10, 15 years after that until 1915 or so, and it was always turned back. The Constitution is a secular document purposefully because, for instance, Article 6 is the one that reads, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." And to remember the context, too, there was a great deal of discrimination among Christians as well. I mean, the Quakers were hated because they were anti-slavery and pacifists, and Catholics were hated. They were the dreaded papists. And so really, if you want to talk about a Christian nation, it would have been much more narrowly defined. And the religious tests that state constitutions passed were very specific, and Jews couldn't vote, for instance, or hold public office in some. And we would see them as very prejudicial and bigoted today. So that Article 6, when it was introduced, was ratified by the constitutional or the convention without much debate. But there was a great deal of debate when it came to ratify it, the time came to ratify it in the different states. And that's another thing that we have to kind of set straight, that the religious right will often say that, well, they meant to put God in there. It just was so obvious they didn't need to put the words in. But we know that's not true, because there was very heated debate to put that language in many different states. And the only two states that had truly secular constitutions were Virginia and New York, I believe. So they were in the minority, but Virginia, of course, is where Thomas Jefferson and James Madison hailed from. And it was very intentional to use that as the basis for this idea of secularism.
And there was still the state constitutions and the federal constitution until, what was it, the 14th Amendment, 16th Amendment?
Oh, to
It was an
assert.
amendment that said that the federal constitution would
Supersede
the state constitutions, but there was still specific Christian tests of office and things in many state constitutions, even as late as the late 1800s.
Yeah, actually, there's a Supreme Court case from 1961 from Maryland where a notary public or a prospective notary public was to undergo a religious test or had to sign an affidavit or something. And it was decided by the Supreme Court very dramatically that this religious test was unconstitutional and any state rights were superseded by the Constitution.
Right. I think it's interesting that you mentioned that the word God isn't in the Constitution, because but in preparation for the show, that was one thing I looked for. And I happened to find a website where someone was rallying that the word Lord was in the Constitution, and I was baffled by that because I swore it wasn't in there, you know, and so I, of course, clicked on it to read it, and yeah, it's in there because they say, "in the year of our Lord."
Right.
which I had to laugh at because that just almost follows the date. You know, I wrote 2009 probably 20 times at work today. I didn't write anything after because I'm not writing flowery documents, but in a sense, I'm saying 2009 years since a supposed Lord. You know, so someone could use that, you know, if they care to look up my documents 200 years from now, they could say, look, he must have believed in Jesus. He wrote 2009, you know. So
remember, it wasn't an afterthought that they forgot to put it in.
Right.
There's a lot of good history. All you have to do is read about the arguments.
There's an excellent little quote that I found from James Madison that I wanted to make a point to say. He says, this was James Madison, he wrote this in 1785, so this is about the right time period for the Constitution. He said, "Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion to all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion to all other sects? That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute," and he goes on to another point about taxes, but he does make a point that if you're establishing Christianity as opposed to other religions, you're also, you know, taking that one further step to say this sect versus another. And then in a later letter he wrote, "The settled opinion here is that religion is essentially distinct from civil government and exempt from its cognizance, that a connection between them is injurious to both." Now, it was James Madison who wrote that. You know, and he signed the Constitution, I believe. So, you know, it wasn't. You know, I don't think you can argue what his intent was.
Right. Well, and you would think that religious people would notice that more. That if they're hoping for their religion to be championed by the government, then they have to hope it always stays that way, because if the government's going to champion one single religion, it could change to another one. England was a case, and then eventually your religion would end up being ostracized if there's only going to be one they champion. There's nations like that in the world where they're a very religious government, but it's only one religion, so or even one sect of one religion. We have a few minutes left here, and I wanted to cover a couple other things that we might think that these are silly, but these are actual arguments that people will use to say that our nation is a Christian nation. They'll say, some arguments put forth is the Pledge of Allegiance says towards the end of it, one nation under God. Our money says, in God we trust. Isn't that the motto of the United States? And an argument that I read recently was, isn't American law based on the Ten Commandments? So go ahead, take whichever ones you want.
Real quickly, the Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy. The words "under God" were added 62 years later in 1954 when President Eisenhower was spurred by Billy Graham and the Knights of Columbus to put that in during the Cold War, because we would only be victorious against godless communists if we were under God. So it's Cold War propaganda, and people don't realize how recent an addition that is.
So 1892, you said, was the year the pledge was first written?
Right.
So already 100 years of history had elapsed, so you can't say that that pledge was formed the founding of our nation.
Had nothing to do with the founding.
Right.
No, not at all.
And then the fact that it was added by Billy Graham, well, he's a contemporary. I mean, he's...
Yes, not that long ago.
He's still alive.
Yeah, he is. So.
Oh, I thought he died recently.
Oh, did he?
Anyway, and in God We Trust, that was kind of a sop to religious interests during the Civil War, when the Secretary of the Treasury, who was very influential at that time, Salmon P. Chase, he wanted to put it on there, and he was originally just going to do it himself. He thought he had the authority, and then he was reminded, no, you have to have Congress approve this. So he managed to get that through, and again, that first appeared in 1864, so again, a long period of time.
When it was first on the money, or just...
Yes, first appeared on coins in 1864, didn't appear on paper currency until 1957. So quite a long time had passed since the founding of the country. Also, I wanted to mention that this doesn't necessarily reflect on Lincoln's religiosity, because Chase was really one of his team of rivals, and they didn't necessarily get along all that well. And it was his real conviction or his movement to have this done. So again, this was almost another propaganda piece during a troubled time in the Civil War, when religious people, as they often will in desperate times, try to rally and make the government under God. Or
I read that during the post-Civil War years in the Reconstruction era, that "In God We Trust" was put on some coins, but so are other phrases that we probably don't think are so lofty, such as "mind your business." So I was trying to find exactly when "In God We Trust" became put on absolutely everything. And did you say the year of that?
Well, in 1957 is when the paper currency got it
okay.
too, and at that point it was universal. There was also a point at which the nickel, the Buffalo nickel, doesn't have "In God We Trust" on it.
Okay.
And ironically, "In God We Trust" was added to the nickel when they put Jefferson on it. And the funny thing is, Jefferson, when he was running for president in 1800, was vilified as an atheist. And all these anti-religious views of Jefferson were brought up. So it's pretty ironic.
So he's probably in heaven hanging his head in shame right now. Right?
Right. Well, if he's in heaven at all.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Looking up from hell.
I know we're running out of time here, but the last point you brought up about the Ten Commandments, only 3 of the 10 Commandments are against the law in America. 7 of them are not. Most of them are thought crimes on one level or another, or they're specifically preferential to one religious view, which are quite explicitly contrary to the founding.
The thought crimes is a good point, because they're good ideas, like don't covet your neighbor's wife. That's a good idea, I think. Marital
but it's
fidelity.
not an enforceable law.
Honor your parents, another good idea. But yeah, I don't ever want it enforced, because like you said, it's a thought crime. So I don't really know how you would actually clarify that.
Murder, stealing, and potentially false witness, although that's only if it's in a court of law.
Right, depending on how you define it.
But also there is an important point. I don't know how much time we've got, but the Keep the Sabbath Holy was a very big issue when it came to mail delivery. That I believe in 1812, mail was delivered 7 days a week, and the post office was open 7 days a week, and a lot of religious people thought this was sacrilege, it shouldn't be done because of this. And that was argued for about 100 years, and it is the source of many great arguments for separation of church and state, where that is specifically cited as the reason we have to keep the mails going on Sunday. And also at that time, of course, it was essential that that happened, because that was the primary mode of information dissemination. There was no electronic media. So you can look at that history and just see many different cases of secularists speaking out on that issue.
And I think one thing, too, that a lot of the religious people in this country don't realize is that those phrases like "one nation under God" and "in God we trust" don't just upset the non-religious, because I grew up very religious, and those things really bothered me. I thought it was extremely hypocritical to have money, I still think it is, to have money say "in God we trust" on it, when clearly you're trusting in the money. That's why you have it in your pocket. That's what I'm about to pay with. I'm not paying on faith. I'm paying with this paper currency. So that really bothered me, and the phrase "one nation under God" was often brought out by members of my religion as another reason to just not say the Pledge of Allegiance. So it didn't just bother the atheists and free thinkers in the nation; it bothered people of other religions too.
And when it comes to "In God We Trust," you agree with Teddy Roosevelt, because he was a big enemy of that. He thought it debased his religion to have that on money, and that was a lot misunderstood, and he was often criticized for that.
All right, well, we'll talk more about this in part 2, but we're out of time now, and I want to thank you, the audience, for listening. If you'd like to contact us at the address you see on the screen, please do so. We'll send you a free copy of our latest newsletter. And if you have any topics that you'd like to discuss or see us discuss here, please let us know. Contact us. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you. Thanks for listening.